afternoon panel. The first panel will be Rabbi Davis Swibel, then Father Robert Sirico, Dr. Todd Williams, and then John Birch. So we'll start, Rabbi, with you and your testimony. Welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. An honor and a pleasure to be here, and an honor and a pleasure to be part of your advisory board. I just think that it's such a wonderful thing that the President has done in appointing this commission to explore some of these issues, because America without a soul is America severely compromised, and something that I don't think our forefathers had in mind at all when they established this great country. I speak here today as a representative of Orthodox Jewish schools across the United States, the happy and wonderful news is that their numbers have been growing, I just remember when I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and went to a yeshiva there called Yeshiva Chafetz Chaim on 89th Street and Riverside Drive. I remember that there were 10 boys in the class. And of the 10 boys, 7 of us knew no grandparents. There were no grandparents. 3 of us had a grandparent, and that was so strange. But that was the norm, because Hitler had killed out that generation. My parents didn't have parents because Hitler had wiped them off the face of this earth. And we grew up that way, and I think to myself now, as I'm a little bit older, a lot older, and think about my parents and what they did when they came to this country, to this wonderful country. And they had the opportunity to say, that's it, we're in America now, we're casting off the ways of the old, and with this we're going to assimilate into the broader society, and we'll rally around those who call for a strict separation between church and state and all of this, right? But these heroic people who had come here, having lost everything, they said, no, we want our children to grow up and be faithful Jews, people who are proud Jews, people who know about their history and their heritage and about their laws and about their lore. And we want our parents, may they rest in peace, in Eden, in the Garden of Eden, to look down and be proud of what has been reestablished and redeveloped here on these shores in the United States of America. And they were heroic in that respect, in building these schools. And so we've been focusing today and in the preceding hearing about the problems in the public schools, and how there are efforts to keep God out of the public schools entirely and any sort of reference to him, and inhibits the free speech in that regard, and religious speech. But then there's a whole other area, which is private schools. And that yeshiva that I went to on West 89th Street in Manhattan was one of the reasons that today, there were only 10 students then, but today there are, in New York alone, we'll talk a little bit more about New York as I proceed with my testimony, but in New York alone, there are today 180,000 children enrolled in Jewish schools in New York, and it's a tale of heroism. It's a tale of renaissance and redemption and ultimate revenge against those who would want to destroy us, and we won't allow it to happen. And we owe so much to this country and to the freedoms that were established in this country that enabled my parents and those in their generation who decided they wanted to maintain and keep this tradition and this vision alive. That without the benevolence of this great country, it never would have happened. So they came to America. They rebuilt, recreated. It's not exactly what it looked like back in Europe, but it's darn close, and it's something which has only a little American spin to it. But it's faithfulness to a God, faithfulness to a people, faithfulness to a vision. I'm departing entirely from my written remarks, but you'll have my written remarks as well and see some of that. But I was very moved this morning and felt somehow that this contribution might be something that's more meaningful still. And I'm worried. And the reason I'm worried is because there have been developments focused largely in New York, though there's some rumbles about it in other parts of the country as well, that government may not be happy and satisfied with what's going on in our yeshivas and in other non-public schools, other religious schools, and they've decided to take a much harder line in terms of oversight. And oversight means, interestingly, oversight doesn't simply mean coming around once a year and checking what's going on. No, oversight means imposing very strict requirements upon these schools so that they will satisfy the statutory mandate that non-public schools must offer an education that is substantially equivalent to that which is offered in the public schools. What does substantially equivalent mean? Right? There are plenty of lawyers around the table here today, and they know that this is a way to make a living for many, many years, litigating over what the phrase substantially equivalent means. How do we become substantially equivalent? Well, the New York State Education Department and the Board of Regents over the past 10 years has come up with a number of different proposed regulations. Some of them were thrown out in the courts, some of them were withdrawn. There is one now, but a number of different iterations of these regulations that would empower the government to come in and insist that a certain number of hours be devoted to a certain specific subjects that must be studied, must be taught by people whom we, the government, say are appropriate, and essentially coming in and taking schools like the Jewish schools, which have a dual program of instruction, where half of the day is, or much of the day is spent on religious studies, and the other part of the day is spent on secular studies. And that duality of programming means that they're in school for long, long hours and involved in a rigorous academic experience. But if you line it up line by line with what's going on in the public schools, and you have to be substantially equivalent, there are differences. They don't have the hours, and they don't. No, they're not going to teach that marriage encompasses things that are other than man and woman. They're not ready to teach their children that. They're not ready to speak about creation, about science from a non-creationist perspective. The first words of the Bible, in the beginning God created, that's what the schools believe in. And so when government comes in and says that we're going to now ask our lawyers whether or not you can be substantially equivalent while at the same time not teaching how the world came to be from a creationist perspective, that's just a potential disaster. Our organization, Agudath Israel of America, and a number of other groups and some courageous individuals have been fighting against this, and we've won some victories over the last 10 years. I won't go into the detail at this hearing. My time is limited. But I think it's important. This is the 100th anniversary of a Supreme Court ruling called Pierce versus Society of Sisters. And that was a case involving a law in the state of, help me anybody, was it Oregon, was it? Oregon, I think, that says that every single child must attend a public school. A public school. And then after the public school is over, you want to go to a private school and study religion, go right ahead. But your main school day must be in a public school. And the Society of Sisters, God bless them, and they said, no, we have parents who want to have a religious education, a more intensive religious education than is possible in the public school system. And they went all the way to the Supreme Court over this issue, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the parents and the school, that the parents have the right to enroll their child in a school other than a public school. That's, to me, that was the single most important decision the United States Supreme Court ever handed down, because that is the foundation upon which the entire network of schools that I mentioned earlier, and the growth of Jewish education and the ability to recreate the world that was destroyed just 70-something years ago, that's all on the foundation of having the ability to teach our children in a strong academic setting of Jewish studies that go alongside the secular studies. Pierce said as follows. I'll read just two sentences, and I'll conclude with this. The fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only. The child is not the mere creature of the state. Those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations. To insist today that private schools, including Jewish and other religious schools, become carbon copies of public schools is just the latest iteration of the state's effort to standardize its children. It's 100 years after Pierce. We ought to know better.
Thank you, Rabbi. And those just joining us, this panel is about protecting religious identity and the autonomy of faith-based schools, all faith-based schools. So thank you for opening. Father Sirico?
Thank you, Commissioners. It's an honor to be with you today. In the 1990s, I served for 4 years on the Civil Rights Commission of the state of Michigan. In 2012, the bishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Grand Rapids assigned me to be pastor of Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish, which is on the west side of the city. Sacred Heart was founded in 1904 by Polish immigrants working in the surrounding gypsum mines. Their vision was simple yet profound: to restore all things in Christ. As part of this mission, they established Sacred Heart School, then a typical K-7 parish school. When I arrived in 2012, both parish and school were struggling. Enrollment had fallen to just 68 students, and the school consumed approximately 90% of the entire parish budget. Like many Catholic schools since the 1960s, Sacred Heart was in steep decline and was slated for merger or closure. Faced with this reality, I had to choose: close the school or reimage its future. After wide consultation with my parishioners, many of whom had been only lightly engaged in parish life up to this point, and with a robust community of homeschooling families, we discerned another path. Rather than shutting our doors, we would refound the school as Sacred Heart Academy, a classical Catholic academy offering daily Mass, rigorous academics, and a deeply traditional and joyous culture. Over the following years, this vision bore fruit beyond anything that we anticipated. Families from across Michigan, even beyond state lines, moved to Grand Rapids to enroll their children. Today, our academy serves over 400 students. That was in a period of about 10 years. This renewal was possible because we stayed faithful to our mission, teaching the Catholic faith in full accord with the Catechism under the approval and oversight of our local diocesan bishop. We are a diocesan school sustained entirely by the sacrifices of families and parishioners. We receive no government funding, not for supplementary public school teachers permitted under conditions by the state of Michigan, not for the federal lunch programs, and not even under the Paycheck Protection Program offered during the COVID pandemic. Sacred Heart Academy is the only school of its kind in the region, Christ-centered, rooted in the perennial wisdom of Scripture and tradition, and committed to supporting parents in the formation of their children. But today, that mission is in jeopardy. Recently, the Michigan Supreme Court reinterpreted the state's non-discrimination law, redefining sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity. This was something we had dealt with on the commission that I served on in the 1990s, but the whole atmosphere has changed. While presented as a matter of fairness, this reinterpretation proposes grave dangers, grave risks for all religious institutions, even those like Sacred Heart that receive absolutely no public support. This new framework would compel us to hire staff whose lives and words openly contradict Catholic teaching, to adopt speech contrary to the Church's doctrine, such as pronoun usage divorced from biological reality, or to suppress Catholic teaching altogether when educating our students or even advertising for enrollment. Worst of all, it infringes upon the rights of parents who have chosen Sacred Heart precisely because it reflects their values and their beliefs. Some have uprooted their families and moved across state lines for this very purpose. Religious schools should not be forced to abandon their mission or compromise their faith. Parents should not be presented with a false Solomonic choice, fidelity to conscience or access to education that reflects their deepest convictions. That is why, with the help of our friends at the Alliance for Defending Freedom, Sacred Heart filed suit against the state. While our case was initially dismissed, the Sixth Court of Appeals reversed that decision and sent it back to the district court, where it remains ongoing. I hope this testimony provides the Commission with a clear perspective on the threats facing Catholic schools. We see our contribution, and I want to really emphasize this, we see our contribution to cultural diversity precisely in being a faithful expression of Catholic identity. That expression must remain free in order to remain diverse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father. And we will come back and ask all questions after all four have testified. Dr. Todd Williams. Dr. Williams.
Thank you. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, Dr. Carson, other members of the commission. It is a privilege to be here, to have an opportunity to speak on this issue of religious liberty in education, in our context, specifically as it relates to Christian higher education and the intrusion upon our independence and identity by accrediting bodies and other regulatory bodies. In addition to serving as the president of Cairn University, I chair the board of the John Jay Institute for Faith, Society, and Law, and serve on the advisory board of the Center for Academic Faithfulness and Flourishing, all of which creates a lot of opportunities for me to talk about this issue of religious liberty in my professional context. But I do want to say I've been at this now for more than 30 years in Christian higher education, and I have to say without hesitation, I've never experienced a season more hostile to faith and the foundations upon which our work rests, namely, as was mentioned this morning so well, the assault on the idea of truth. So at an institution like ours, every student, in addition to their liberal arts and professional studies, take 30 hours, 1/3 of their curriculum in Bible and theology. They take a required civics course in which the United States Constitution is the central text. They are told all the time that they are truth seekers, not truth makers. We work to drive into them a biblical worldview, a correct understanding of God themselves and the world in which they live. We have a faculty and staff that sign affirmation of our foundational statements, which is not just a statement of faith, but includes a statement of the implications of that statement of faith for the way in which they carry out their work. We are, to our very core, a Christian institution that is driven by and guided by our Christian convictions, our Christian theology, our Christian tradition. And in 30 years, I haven't experienced what we've experienced in the last several in terms of the direct attempts to undermine that, not just unsettle it, but undermine it, and not just diminish it, but to eradicate it. And I have several examples that I'd like to walk through, but I would say that in recent years, my observation is that regulatory and accrediting bodies, both professional accrediting bodies and other academic associations, as well as the broader academic guild that is part of American higher education, I think really have taken aim at the distinctives of Christian higher learning in a very insidious way. And I think that institutions like Cairn University and many other fine Christian universities across the country, where the learning objectives and the course content and curriculum is all designed to be biblically integrated, this is a bit of a problem because the way in which we carry out our work is an attempt to be biblical to our very core. And so we're challenged in terms of the challenges that come to our distinctives. And as was already mentioned here, our constituencies actually are looking for that. They desire those distinctives. They're paying for those distinctives. They're seeking out that kind of education. We're not actually attempting to foist that on a state university that's more public in nature. We're a private institution where our students and families are coming to us for precisely this kind of education. So our mission, ethos, programs, like all of our sister schools, are intentionally Christian, and we don't apologize for that. We also believe that these things are protected under the guarantee of religious liberty in the Constitution, and we make sure that our students understand that. Take a great deal of time in the U.S. government class to say, look, the original Bill of Rights, everything's worded in the negative. They assume these rights are inherent from God and can't be infringed upon. The government didn't give them to you, or the government can take them from you. Those are the things that we talk to our students about all the time, and that's our posture as an institution with regard to regulatory bodies and accrediting bodies, particularly in the area of overreach. In implicit and explicit ways, pressure has been put upon institutions like ours, I think, that puts a strain upon the security we cling to regarding religious liberty. From peer review site visit teams, and this has happened where a group of peers come from other institutions to review your institution, which in regional accreditation we've just passed with flying colors, but you have members of those teams from time to time who will ask questions. Do you really think you should say that in your mission statement? Isn't that, a little too explicitly Christian? Well, did you read our mission statement? Do you understand, who we are and what we do? But when a peer review team says you really shouldn't have a mission statement worded that way, it's important for all of us to understand they don't get to tell us what the mission statement is. They only get to ask us if we have one and if we're measuring the effectiveness of it. I think that kind of clarity is absolutely essential to carrying out our work in this particular sector of education. But that pressure comes in those things like peer review site team members asking those questions, to the outright insistence of accrediting bodies or governmental departments to create learning outcomes, student competencies, or even curriculum that are, and I will say this without reservation, creedal in nature. It is very clear that we're not just being asked to sort of tone down our rhetoric and understanding of who we are and what we do. There are creedal language that's being foisted upon us that you need to include these things. I've never in 30 years seen an outside body say that one of your learning competencies should be that students believe X, Y, Z. I mean, we're a Christian institution, and I don't force my students to do that when they graduate. I mean, that's the nature of it. And so the idea that an accrediting body would say you must build curricular outcomes and curriculum that explicitly teaches students to believe a particular thing about human sexuality, about the family, is incredibly problematic for institutions like ours. And we represent, I think, a pretty broad swath of colleges and universities across the country. I think there's a fierce determination in academic culture to inculcate secular ideologies and sensibilities in the students who've chosen to study at a Christian college. I did my graduate work at a secular institution. I had no misgivings about what I would experience there. But when students come to an institution like ours, they want to be assured that they're going to be taught in a Christian manner from people who hold a Christian worldview. Well, the best example I can give you of this is related to our decision to close our social work program, which was in place for about 50 years. In 2021, we chose to close the social work program, eliminating both a BSW degree and a newly launched MSW degree in light of the Council for Social Work Education's overreach. Now, I've been dealing with this organization for a long time, and I provided you a detailed article that I wrote for the James Martin Center for Academic Renewal that outlines the specifics of the closure. But the Council for Social Work Education, which accredits social work programs, has an inordinate degree of power for such a body, in my opinion, and I think this is a problem across professional accrediting bodies for sure. The Council for Social Work Education, which accredits social work programs, has that kind of power because you cannot become a licensed social worker without graduating from a CSWE school. When we closed the program in 2021 and then taught our students out under our accrediting obligations, the first correspondence that I got was from an individual in Southern California who was an attorney and said, I'm not a person of faith, I'm not a Christian, I've been watching this organization for a while, and I have to believe that they're in violation of at least one or two antitrust laws, because they control it from beginning to end. You cannot be a licensed social worker unless you graduate from an accredited social work school. When we closed the program in 2021, the CSWE and the NASW launched a PR campaign very publicly with petitions and pressure to reverse our decision, to attempt to shame us into reversing our decision. They incited our own alumni against us. They wrote a number of pieces. We had investigative reporters all over us criticizing that work, from the AP and other news outlets to even a few Christian publications, criticizing our decision to voluntarily withdraw from voluntary accreditation because it was no longer tenable for us as a Christian institution. And that kind of pressure is also the overreach. It's not just the overreach on regulation or accreditation, it's that they assume that they have the power to force us to change our minds. They reported us for ethical violations, integrity violations, to try to reverse the decision. At the end of the day, the Board of Trustees approved a proposal from the university's administration to close the program because it was no longer tenable for us to serve that population and provide those degree programs. This organization also had a lot of standards for faculty-student ratios, which were not rooted in any kind of market forces or economic thinking. If you had 20 students, you needed 1 full-time. If you had 21, because it's a 1 to 20, you needed 2 full-time. Without any sort of sensitivity to market forces or economics, we had to comply with those. And then on top of that, they would often, after review, suggest or recommend that all diversity initiatives and efforts at the university would be put under the oversight and guidance of the social work faculty, to which we always said no. It was intrusive, and we'll make our own decisions about how we manage those. But that accrediting body was actually seeking, I think, to reshape not just our academic curriculum, but the culture of our institution. And so we voluntarily withdrew from that. We weathered the PR storm, and I think have put that behind us. But I want to say that there was this attempt to actually bring into our institution learning outcomes and compel us to write curriculum that was rooted in Marxism and intersectionality, especially as it applied to matters of human sexuality and gender. When we stated that we were closing the program because that is untenable for us as a Christian school that holds the Bible to have central authority, they didn't deal with the sex and gender issue. They attacked us for being racist. And so we were labeled as racists and homophobes and ignorant educators who didn't understand those needs. So we've been through the ringer on that one and have come through it. And I think our course of action has been to push back and say no, that this is who we are and this is what we do.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. We'll come back with questions. Thank you. John?
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Dr. Carson, it's a privilege to be here to talk about one of the most culturally and legally significant issues of the day, which is religious liberty for our religious schools, parents, and families. I'm John Bursch, Vice President of Appellate Advocacy with Alliance Defending Freedom. I've argued 13 U.S. Supreme Court cases, and the court has granted 6 of our last 7 requests to hear our cases, and so many of these involve the issues that we're talking about. I'll briefly address 5 points. First, religious freedom is critical for faith-based schools, and that is under attack. We all understand that religious liberty is not merely the right to practice your faith in your place of worship. As Commissioner Metaxas said this morning, it's about the right to live out religious truths in society. And that's why faith-based schools exist, because parents, families, and communities want education to be grounded in truth, virtue, and eternal goals. They're not just private versions of public schools. But increasingly, government officials are attacking schools' religious freedom. You've heard several examples. Another is the Lyceum, a small Catholic prep school in South Euclid, Ohio. We had the privilege of representing them, and they had to sue to protect their rights when the city council passed a sweeping ordinance that required them to hire teachers and enroll students who disagree with its mission and teachings on matters of human sexuality, such as hiring teachers in same-sex relationships. They could be fined. They could even spend time in jail if they violated this. There was a draft of the ordinance that had a specific religious exemption in it. The council intentionally took it out, and that forced the school to decide if they would give up its faith, which it would never do, or close. Fortunately, they were able to sue and were successful. But these religious education opportunities teach character traits that we should value as a society, seeking the good of others, providing a framework for understanding the world, strengthening community bonds. Government should be encouraging these type of values to be taught in our citizens and not discriminating against them because of their religious beliefs. Second, religious freedom is critical for the families and the children who choose them. The Supreme Court has long recognized, 100 years, that parents have a fundamental right to direct their children's upbringing, including their education, but there are many school choice programs that are intentionally designed to exclude religious schools. Famously, you all know about the Carson v. Macon case, where the Supreme Court held that Maine's improper exclusion of religious schools for their town tuitioning program was unconstitutional. What's less well known is that before that decision, in anticipation of it, the Maine legislature amended its laws to require religious schools to comply with the state's LGBTQ orthodoxy in order to get those funds. And so they're still not getting paid. Those schools are in litigation right now. And in Colorado, the state excluded Darren Patterson Christian Academy from a state-funded grant for preschool programs unless the academy agreed to hire employees who don't share its faith and to alter their internal rules and policies based on sexuality and gender, including restroom usage, pronouns, dress codes, and even student housing during field trips. And these are the kinds of laws that punish families and schools for making the choices to teach religious education. Third, religious liberty is under attack in schools. You've heard from all of our panelists about that. I want to just focus in on what Michigan is doing to Sacred Heart, Father Sirico's school that he founded. Following that Michigan Supreme Court decision, the Michigan legislature codified it by amending its education laws to comply with that statute and requiring Michigan schools to hide the truth about marriage and the human body. So under that amended law, Sacred Heart not only has to hire staff who seek to overturn the Catholic Church's teaching on marriage and use preferred pronouns, allow males who identify as girls to be on the female athletic teams and use the girls' locker rooms, but they have to refrain from teaching St. Pope John Paul II's theology of the body or Pope Francis's teachings about gender ideology. If they even post those on their website, they're in violation of state law. And yet when there was a religious exemption proposed in the legislature, it was turned down. The governor signed that discriminatory law, and Attorney General Dana Nessel has fought ferociously to defend it against their free exercise claims. Fourth point, the president and his administration can do much to protect religious liberty. Hopeful that at the end of all the evidence that you're gathering that you'll urge him to direct executive agencies to ensure that federal funds never come with strings attached that require schools to violate their conscience, and to require that states and local governments respect religious liberty. You can tell Michigan, you can tell New York, you can tell accreditation agencies, you cannot do this. The president can appoint departmental leaders who will protect religious liberty instead of erode it. And most important, he can use the presidential platform to encourage Congress to enact laws. Talking about this stuff is great, executive orders are great, but unless we have permanent change with legislation, these problems are going to continue to exist. And he should use that platform to explain why religious liberty in schools is so important. Finally, the Supreme Court has consistently acted to protect religious liberty in the schools, but there's so much more to do. In Our Lady of Guadalupe, the court reaffirmed the ministerial exception. You're all familiar with that. We're hopeful the Supreme Court will soon supplement that by recognizing that religious organizations, including schools, have the right to hire co-religionists too. If a Christian school believes that every employee's duties includes inculcating the church's teachings in the students, they shouldn't have to hire a secular atheist in the cafeteria or on the janitorial staff whose goal is to turn students away from God. We need that protection. That trilogy of cases that began with Trinity Lutheran, that was an ADF case, then Espinoza culminating in Carson. You can see how easily Maine is trying to circumvent that with its shenanigans about its LGBTQ law. Just last term in Mahmoud, the Supreme Court definitively pronounced that parents have a First Amendment right to direct their children's upbringing and education consistent with their parents' faith. You'll recall that case was about LGBTQ school materials that were being peddled to kids as young as 4 years old without parents being told about that or having an opportunity to opt out. The court said many Americans, like the parents in this case, believe that biological sex reflects divine creation, that sex and gender are inseparable, and that children should be encouraged to accept their sex and to live accordingly. These are fundamental rights, but activists have already said that they're going to fight against this ruling and promise that they'll make religious families bend the knee to LGBTQ orthodoxy, and that means shutting down their schools if necessary. So in conclusion, religious liberty should not be a partisan issue. It's a matter of human dignity, family rights, and national flourishing. Our nation will continue to benefit from generations of young people formed both in knowledge and virtue if faith-based schools are protected to live out their missions and families are free to choose them. Conversely, if that liberty is impaired, our country will be worse for it educationally, culturally, and spiritually. When we lose social work programs at Christian universities because of hostile accreditation agencies, that's a problem. So I encourage you to do everything that you can to advocate that the federal government take real meaningful steps to make these protections put in place in law, because doing so will ensure that faith-based education remains a beacon of truth, hope, and human flourishing in this country for many generations to come. Thank you.
Eric Metaxas?
I think it was, first of all, thank you, all of you, for your testimony. I think it was 1980 or 84 when Father Richard John Newhouse wrote his famous book, The Naked Public Square. And we've been dealing with this now. It's 45 years since he wrote the book, and the problem existed long before he wrote the book. And it's this idea that we live in a culture where religion has been defined in a strange way that I think is against the vision of the founders. Religion has been defined in such a way that it's this strange thing over here which we secularists will tolerate. That's really not the founders' vision. In fact, it completely abrogates the founders' idea of freedom itself. And somehow, I don't know what recommendation we can make in the end, but that ultimately is the problem at the root of all of this, is that it's not as though there's such a thing as a neutral world and a secular world, but will allow you to have your religion. At the end of the day, everything is ultimately religious because it deals with the ultimate questions. So when you take a view that says we're going to impose this LGBTQ curriculum, or these are fundamentally religious, but they have pretended that, no, you're the religious one and we are somehow secular or somehow neutral. That's patently false, and I think we've gone along with it long enough, and we have to understand that what we're dealing with here is a misunderstanding of the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause means that secular religion cannot be established. And anytime anyone tries to do that, it would be no different than when they would accuse me of saying, if I have these values, I'm imposing a theocracy by having such values. But that's ineffectively what the secular left has done. And I think unless we undo that, we're constantly fighting. It's whack-a-mole. It's constantly, they're going to attack, this Catholic institution. They're going to attack a yeshiva. They're going to basically continue to do this because they have the hermeneutic lever, I guess. We have to take that away from them, and we somehow have to make them understand that there is no such thing as neutrality on these issues. Anything that touches on the big questions is fundamentally religious. And so if your view is opposing or pushing against a biblical or a Christian worldview, if you're pushing against what you call a religious worldview, you are yourself taking a religious position, and that's not neutral. So I don't know what we can do about that, but that was the understanding of the founders and of Americans for, until I guess this morning we heard until John Dewey started getting involved in this kind of thing. But we've never pushed back sufficiently against it, and I think we're now seeing the nihilistic fruit. And unless we can go to the bottom of it and say, you are trying to establish a religion which you don't call a religion, I don't know that we ever get out of this. We're constantly playing defense. And I don't know if that was a question. Let me just say true or false.
Any comments from the witnesses?
There we go. Take a stab at that. I think that is true, but I think there's much that we can do because the law is a teacher. The reason that most people believe that murder is wrong is because the law prohibits it. The reason that many people think that abortion is okay is because for 49 and a half years, the US Supreme Court said that's not murder. And so if we enact laws that talk about the truth of marriage, that talk about the reality of the human body and things like that, and yes, there'll be constitutional questions with those things, those things teach too. And it's not enough for us just to stand up in the public square and talk about these things. The law needs to assist us in teaching the very principles that you're talking about. And that's the thing that's going to create the sea change that you're looking for culturally. And double that when it comes to religious liberty. If the law teaches that yeshivas and Christian colleges and Catholic K through 12 schools must be protected, then people will learn that that's what must be protected. And so, talking is great, law is better. It's a terrific teacher.
Rabbi, do you want to add something?
I do, and I thought that the insight was a very good one, Eric, but, I mean, let's face it, the reality is that our society in general has moved in a direction away from religion being the default position that most people have. The fact that, I'm just focusing for a moment on the growth of the Jewish schools, which is a wonderful thing, but if you look more generally about the religious school population in the United States, you see Catholic schools closing right and left, and you see numbers going down in terms of church participation. So we have to. I'm not sure we're going to get to the place of passing those laws unless somehow we can recapture the culture, and I worry very deeply about that because I think in general as a society we've been moving away from that, and that's why, again, at least in our community, we have made a very conscious decision to promote private education, Jewish education within Orthodox Jewish families, because the general atmospheric out there in society at large is just pushing in the opposite direction very, very fiercely.
Father Sirico?
I think it's very important that we are, am I on? There we go. I think it's very important, at least from my perspective, I want to be clear that I'm not advocating the creation of a theocracy. I'm very happy to have a competition, a cultural competition of ideas. And while there has been a decline, for example, Rabbi, in the population in Catholic schools, a large part of that has precisely been because of the shift in the culture generally, and the shift even of the culture within Catholic education in adopting these nihilistic and, shall we say, Deweyistic pedagogy that explicitly eliminates or attempts to eliminate God. I'd welcome a neutral competition of countercultural ideas, Judeo-Christian cultural ideas, with a secularist idea, because I think ultimately our perspective tells man more about himself than the secularist and materialist idea. And in this regard, if I may scandalize this commission, I would advocate that we follow the advice of a prominent Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, who advocated the takeover or the influence of the commanding heights of society. That's exactly what we're confronting right now. They own the commanding heights of entertainment, of literature, of movies, of educational systems as we see here and now, and of the churches. And what we need to do is retrieve that. We don't need to enforce this by an ideology or a theocracy, because theocracy is bad both for religion and for society. I think what we need to do is just have the confidence that what built Western civilization can once again rebuild Western civilization.
Thank you. Great question. See, it was a question, Eric. See, it was a question. It was a question. Let me go to Ryan next. Or do you want to make a quick comment, Carrie, on what they said, or you want me to?
Yeah, I just had a question.
Yeah, go. If you want to follow up, then Ryan and then Dr. Carson.
Mine will be quick. It's for Father Sirico. I wanted you to just tell us a little bit about what's going on with your case. I think it's important that we hear kind of the latest update about what's going on.
suited to tell you the latest details of that. I've been too involved with hearing confessions and visiting the sick in hospitals.
God bless you.
So after the Sixth Circuit reinstated the case, it went back to the district court, and there was an injunction that was entered to protect the school while the litigation was pending. That was incredibly important to us. Discovery is just wrapping up now. The state continues to rebuff all the discovery requests to just clarify what their position is. Are you really going to persecute the school if they put the theology of the body in their curriculum? It's been difficult to get them to answer those questions because the longer they can dodge that, the longer they can escape liability. But there'll be dispositive motion briefing coming up in the near future on that.
Let me make it clear with regard to Sacred Heart that we will not conform to this. We will either remain an institution committed to the principles upon which we're founded, or we'll close the school, in which case I've already thought about how we organize a network of homeschooling people to continue this cultural and religious mission.
God bless you.
Ryan?
But we're going to win.
Yes, I believe so. The tectonic plates are shifting, I have a feeling.
So I like, Father Robert, your idea that we want the Orthodox school to be robustly, authentically Jewish. We want your Catholic school to be robustly, authentically Catholic. We want the Protestant school to be robustly Protestant. What I've noticed is that there's a common threat to all three of those schools, and it's come out in the testimony this afternoon and this morning with Monica Gill's testimony, and that's these sexual orientation and gender identity laws. SOGI is the acronym, if you're not familiar with this. Father Robert, you mentioned that it was a state Supreme Court ruling that simply redefined the word sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity, right? You didn't even need to pass a law. You know, lo and behold, it was always there. A decade ago, I was an expert witness in front of a different U.S. commission. It was the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And then and it was on religious liberty and non-discrimination principles. And then the following year, they issued their 307-page report. I just pulled this up. And this is what the chairman of that commission wrote in his introduction. He says, so long as the phrases religious liberty and religious freedom the phrases religious liberty and religious freedom will stand for nothing except hypocrisy, so long as they remain code words for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, Christian supremacy, or any form of intolerance. Right, and that was the solution a decade ago, was that these non-discrimination principles must prevail. Religious liberty needs to take a back seat. And if you are exercising your religious liberty to bear witness to and to educate a biblical understanding of human sexuality, you're using religious liberty simply as code for your homophobia, your discrimination, your intolerance, et cetera, et cetera. So my question for all four of you, because ultimately 6 months from now, we're issuing advice to President Trump on what he can do, what his administration can do to protect religious liberty. And obviously, one of the recommendations is don't redefine the word sex to mean sexual orientation and gender identity. Don't pass legislation that would make sexual orientation and gender identity a protected class. But what can we advise him to do, particularly when the states have done this? And John, this may be more in your area of expertise. What does the U.S. Constitution have to say when the states have already redefined non-discrimination principles in a faulty way? How should we think about how to harmonize these if they're harmonizable? Or does there need to be a hierarchy? How do we think this through?
There we go. Well, the great thing we have at the federal level is the Supremacy Clause, which says that federal law will control even over state Supreme Court decisions, over state constitutional amendments, over state laws. And so the federal government can define things to be non-discriminatory, that it's not discrimination for a school under Title IX to assign sports teams by sex instead of by gender identity. We have those two cases with Idaho and West Virginia going up before the Supreme Court in January. Well, one of those involves Title IX. The legislature or the Congress and the president can make clear that's not discrimination, that it's not discrimination to say that a biological boy doesn't get to sleep with the girls on field trips simply because he identifies as female. So there's a lot that the government can do. I agree completely with Father Sirico, not to establish a theocracy, but simply to recognize recognize some realities and back it up with all the science that we have that shows that this is far from discriminatory, but instead this is what's good for human flourishing. I mean, you know as well as anybody how harmful gender ideology has been to our children and young people. Well, let's put that in a law so that people know that that's the case, that this is something that is to help people. It's because we love them, we want them to flourish, not because of any animus or anything else. So those are the kinds of recommendations that I would support. Affirmative steps that make clear that biological truth, for example, is a positive good.
And I think that this issue of, particularly in both in the K-12 world and in higher education, what the administration could do is to provide those safeguards. Look, I mean, to Eric's point, it's a cultural issue, right? We used to say politics was downstream of culture. I don't really think that applies anymore. I think they're conflated and they're weaponizing one another all the time to carry out cultural agendas. The issue, I think, is making it possible for institutions like ours to actually teach a view that says, actually, this is created order. It was for our good, for the good of the world, and for the glory of God. If you make that wrong for us to say, no matter what law you pass, it's not going to, we have to be free to say that. That's what we believe. That's what we believe to be true. This is God's created order for the good of the world. And I think that's the issue of religious liberty. I think we have to defend it, not because people of faith, we lose our liberty. You read the Bible. You proclaim the gospel from prison. We will do what we do. But religious liberty is good for the country and good for the world, because when that voice is lost, everything unravels. And I think that that's really important for us to push those cultural things. So we have to be protected to keep teaching the way we teach, so that we have students going out and making that difference. I think that's a protection that we desperately need.
Thank you. Dr. Carson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for your eloquent presentations today. I'm thinking this question primarily for Rabbi Zweibel, but anyone can answer. Pre-Holocaust, there were things going on similar to some of the things you've described. What are you recognizing in today's society that could lead us there? And was there a time that recognition of those could have avoided the Holocaust?
It's a difficult question, and I would not have the chutzpah, if I could use some of the vernacular, to try to answer it in a way which is fully satisfying, certainly. But those of us who grew up in an America where there was anti-Semitism, without question. I remember as a child playing in Riverside Park on the Upper West Side, and we had some of the neighborhood toughs who would take our bats and balls away and things like that. So there was anti-Semitism, but it was tempered by the spirit of generosity and dignity that pervaded American society in ways that somehow the Europeans did not have. We talk about it all the time, that the world has changed, and the world is changing, and it's changing in a dangerous direction. And maybe we were fortunate enough to have lived lives that were basically comfortable and free of discrimination, and we had opportunities to, all of the bounties and opportunities available in America was something that we accessed and did very beautifully and built beautiful families and structures. But the world has changed. Even before October 7, the incidence of anti-Semitism in this country was significantly higher than it had been, for whatever reason. And of course, that has been compounded exponentially in the wake of October 7 and everything that's come about since then. So I don't know. I tend to think about these things in theological terms, aside from cultural and social terms and historic terms. But in a theological question, somehow the hand of God is behind all of this, and what is it that he's trying to tell us? And I think that's an important question, certainly within the Jewish community, but I would say for all faith communities to grapple with today, because we live in a society, in a world today that looks very different and feels very different than it did, even just 10 years ago.
Kelly?
Just a quick question, since we're trying to come up with recommendations to the president. On accreditations from any source, but especially the state, that interfere with the religious liberty, one way to go back against that is a constitutional argument, like a lawsuit, John. Another is passing maybe some federal laws to define things. Is there anything else? I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Have you in your struggles come across any other things that we could suggest to the president as a recommendation that would have an impact in that area?
I think you have to protect the financial aid that our students receive. I think someone mentioned earlier, one of the sessions about the lever that money and funding is. I think that has to be protected in a significant way, really sort of firewalled, because once that becomes the threat, see what will happen there is they don't even have to actually pull it off. They just say, we'll threaten to take away the Pell Grants in your states, your state grants, if you're not in compliance with this particular set of values or these competencies. All they have to do is threaten that, and all the schools will begin to cave because they're worried about the millions of dollars that'll go out the door and all of that. So I think while in the private sector, we're sort of bolstering for that and trying to find ways to mitigate that if that were to happen. I think protecting that there would be a way to sort of really further protect that funding that students receive would be one way to do it. I think that's a little bit of a preemptive strike that it doesn't become a kind of leverage used against religious institutions. It's really tough. I mean, I think one of the things is, again, there's this accreditation is so complicated if you don't understand how there's regional institutional accreditation, there are institutional accrediting bodies, there's programmatic and professional accrediting bodies, and they all operate somewhat differently, and some of them are more assertive than others. But I think an investigation into a number of the accrediting bodies that are overreaching would be really helpful. In what ways are accrediting bodies going beyond learning outcomes and competencies and actually beginning to sort of attempt to indoctrinate students? That's really sort of, I think, a bigger issue. Where are they overreaching? Our regional accrediting body is great. We say, no, that this is who we are and this is what we do. Okay, how are you measuring that you're doing it? Great, that's fine. Another one is actually saying, no, you have to actually teach this, and we want to see your students come out with this set of values and these beliefs. That's out of bounds. In the case of the social work decision, that's really them. You can't go anywhere else. You want people to go into that profession, you have to go to a CSWE school. So I do think that some sort of inquiry or look at what accrediting bodies are doing on that front, and then protecting the money. Two things that I would say.
Dr. Williams, you said that in your 30 years, you haven't seen the assault on faith-based schools that you're seeing now. So why has it changed now? Is it the last 4 years before this election? Does it go back 20 years, 10 years?
Yeah.
Did it creep in? Did it happen suddenly? In your view, what's caused it?
Yeah, I think, look, there's no question, in fact, in the remarks I submitted, I made this statement, there's no question that this administration, we all are enjoying a lot more breathing room right now with this administration. I mean, and in 2015, I was summoned to meetings where we were all preparing for Armageddon in terms of federal funding and all kinds of other things. Then President Trump was elected and things really did cool off, And then I think in this administration, we do have some breathing room, but none of us who have watched this for any length of time, there's a cultural issue. And I would say there's a convergence of all kinds of things, the undermining of truth, the sort of long-held, it's longer than 1915, a long sort of infiltration of secularism in our culture, a misunderstanding of what religious liberty is, somehow that if you believe in religious liberty, you're after a theocracy and you're a Christian nationalist, when really what you're saying is the founders wanted us to be a place where we had that freedom because they assumed we were given that freedom by the Creator. I think it's gotten worse too because everything is sort of politics has become one of the weapons to move culture, if that makes sense. I think that's really what's happened. And I think, so I could look back over several administrations over my 30-year career where I'd say, yeah, politics is really coming after us on some cultural, we actually refer to them as cultural. They're not cultural issues, they're theological and biblical issues for us, but they're calling them cultural issues, and political administrations and other are coming after us on those cultural issues, and politics is being used to move culture. And I think it would be, naive not to think that there is some political way through this where we just have to protect people's beliefs. But I would say it's gotten worse largely because you have this sort of an undermining of truth. The country is divided, not just politically, culturally. And the major divide between us is whether or not we believe there's an absolute moral authority above humanity. I mean, you have people who they just believe they're the ultimate moral authority. That's the big dividing line. And every conversation I get in, if we start to get to worldview, that's it. No, I don't believe in a higher moral authority according to which we should order our lives in society. I believe it's up to me as an individual. Well, I don't know where to go from there. And I think that division is really plaguing us right now. And it's a cultural question, not just a political one.
Father?
What I'm going to propose, I think, very honestly, exceeds the competency of this commission and the competency of this administration, because everything you have described, Dr. Williams, points to an existential threat. And what empowers that existential threat is the high reverence that we have, or acquiescence that we have given to politics itself. And this very commission is set up to tinker with the thing. And it's good. I want to encourage you, tinker. But the real radical solution to this, the question you asked is, what were the prerequisites, the things that happened prior to the Holocaust? It was the growth of the state, and it was the acquiescence of moral leadership in the country at the time. And I'm talking here about pastors in particular. But what you have with the state is the takeover of the role of the pastor, the role of other moral leaders in society by politicians, by the state, by the bureaucracy, which even governs the politicians, as we see. So the solution to this thing is far more radical. We have to think of this in existential terms. And we have to come at this project with the understanding that this is going to take years to transform, and it's going to take, and this is why religious people can transform the world. We believe in something that's greater than our politics and that our culture, and that we can re-envision. If you want to just talk about something like the granting of money, let's rethink the way we do that whole thing. I mean, this, if we're ever going to happen, if this is ever going to happen, it's going to happen under this administration, because they're willing to go after this stuff. We were not willing. Don't stop. Keep going. And re-envision how money is allocated in society. You don't need to take the money up to give it to a bureaucracy and send it back down, because that's what creates the manipulation. Why not leave it with people? Let people have freedom to recohere the way our society functions, so that your students, parents, and their families and businesses have the opportunity to fund those kinds of things, so you're not dependent on Pell Grants and things like that.
So in Texas, we have 5.5 million students in public schools. We have about 250,000 in private schools. Some are faith-based. We have about 300,000 in public charter schools, and about 600,000 to 700,000, we don't know the exact number, of homeschoolers, which is growing dramatically. Father, you talked about you may move to that direction if you're shut down. And as a state legislator, as lieutenant governor, what I've always found in that case is just the money. It's just about the money. The public schools want every dollar you have. And every dollar you're ever going to get. And they want every dollar out of transportation and every dollar out of health care. And the unions drive that, and the administration drives it, and the budgets go up, and the outcomes are worse. So it's about money at that level. Going full circle from Charlie Kirk, I read the other day that someone said they didn't take his life because of what he was saying. They took his life because too many people were listening. So I think that brings us hope. And I think another reason besides the money to put all of you out of business, because they don't like the fact that you have families and a new generation listening. The money and their fear of people listening to the truth is a deadly combination for us. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
We have one more panel for today. We'll give them an opportunity to change out the nameplates. And after this panel, we have about 10 minutes of closing remarks from the Heritage Foundation and from the Department of Education. Secretary McMahon couldn't be here, but she has sent someone to speak. So on this commission, we're going to talk about parents' rights, school choice, other issues dealing with the bigger picture that we just talked about in Texas a little bit with our numbers. Carol Conley is with us, Laura Slavis is with us, Jason Bedrick, and Professor Nicole Garnett. So Carol Conley, up first.
Am I green? There we go. First of all, Commissioner and all you, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Before I actually give the historical context of what's going on in Maine and what's going on with Bangor Christian Schools, I'd want you to know this is a deeply personal issue for me. I was raised in a wonderful Christian home with consistent, loving parents, but my first 2 years of high school was filled with very dark and destructive behavior that I hid from my parents. At the end of my sophomore year, I begged them, even though they were both employees, my father was a Hall of Fame basketball coach, and I was not a bad athlete, but I begged them to go to Bangor Christian Schools, and thank God they let me go. I was weak, and I knew it, and I needed faculty, and I needed schoolmates that would support my parents' worldview rather than tear it down. And those 2 years completely changed the trajectory of my life as I came back home to Christ as a result of that Christian education. My freshman year in college, I answered the call to Christian education. I wasn't expecting to be involved in education, but I knew that I wanted to give every family the chance that I had as a result of Christian education. So upon graduating, the next 19 years I spent in Massachusetts in exile as a maniac, but then my last 8 years as a headmaster at Bangor Christian Schools. So the 2 years that I spent there as a student, my faculty who were former students, teachers of mine, said that I spent about the same amount of time there in the principal's office as I did when I was a student. During those 2 years, though, as a student, many families took advantage of what is the second oldest school choice program in our country. High schools, or towns that did not have high schools, were allowed to pay the high school tuition to any school at that time. And so it was a wonderful opportunity for those, especially rural and many times financially challenged people, to have access to a Christian education. But all that changed in 1980 when our Maine's Attorney General stated that allowing so-called sectarian schools to participate with public funding was against the establishment clause of the United States Constitution. That stopped, and then Maine's legislation then added laws and regulations that completely stopped all Catholic and Protestant and faith-based schools to participate in this program. It was a shame. And as an observer myself, as I said, spending years in Massachusetts as a headmaster, and then those last 8 years back in Bangor Christian, it was very, very sad. It was discouraging to watch attempt after attempt after attempt to reverse this bad decision. And our school was right in the middle of that. As a headmaster, we thought we'd be there, and then we'd lose. We thought we'd be there, then we'd lose. But then came Carson Macon. And Carson Macon means a lot to us. I hired Bonnie Carson as a second grade teacher, and then her son David, even though he didn't want to be there, was a student of mine at Bangor Christian School, and then that all changed. He put Olivia in, and Olivia is the student. Olivia Carson is the individual whose tuition is being litigated. But when Carson Mason first occurred, I have to admit, I was buoyed by Espinoza and Trinity that was mentioned earlier. But I was afraid to be enthusiastic and optimistic because I had been jaded so many years. But I can tell you, when the SCOTUS came about and allowing those schools to participate again, saying that it was constitutional to allow that, we were exuberant. And I was down here with First Liberty Institute, and I was with the Carson family doing these proceedings. I was so happy. I was exuberant. I thought of the meetings that I'd had over the years with parents that tearfully had to take their kids out of school, because of finances. I thought of the moms, the single moms, especially in our state, that were praying and hoping for a good decision so they could have the same opportunity I had. It was so exciting. But unfortunately, not everybody shared my jubilation in the state. And Aaron Fry, our Attorney General, immediately put out a statement, and I've included his full statement. But basically, he said that we're going to do everything we could do as administration to keep bigotry and intolerance and discrimination being funded in our state. But probably out of his quote, the most concerning one was saying the education that these schools at issue that offer are inimical to public education. Now, I started my education career as an English teacher. I have to admit, I had to look up what inimical meant. But it means adverse, hostile, by reason of malevolence. I had to practice saying malevolence a few times as well. But there was no irony lost on me that the first response to this wonderful SCOTUS thing that we've been waiting, this decision for so many years, that he would use a synonym of hostile, because his very first response was evidence of the decades-long hostility towards any attempt for religious education in our state. And so it was adverse, but thankfully, even though that the legislature took action that John talked about earlier, and that we have an administration that's very much against us, thankfully First Liberty Institute and Consovoy McCarthy have challenged that legislation in federal court, and hopefully the first district will uphold what the U.S. Supreme Court has said repeatedly, including in Carson and Macon, that Maine violates the Free Exercise Clause when it excludes observers from otherwise available public benefits. And that should include schools like Bangor Christian benefiting from their tuition program. So despite academic and social excellence that schools like Bangor Christian have shown, and so many other areas than social outcomes, Maine families still face blatant discrimination. But again, based upon my rescue story, this breaks my heart. And so I thank God for the Trump administration shedding light on this, and with this assembled commission, and thanks to all of you for your time in this process.
Thank you very much. Sir, you're up next. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and Commission, thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. My name is, absolutely. My name is Nicholas Reeves. I'm a senior counsel at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, and I'm the co-director of Yale Law School's Free Exercise of Religion Clinic. As an attorney at Beckett, I represent a group of Jewish families who all have children with disabilities. These families were forced to sue the state of California just to get equal access to the same federal and state special education funding as everybody else. I want to share their story with you today for two reasons: to inform your work as a commission, and to ensure that no other families have to go through what these families went through. All parents try to find the best educational fit for their children. But when children have disabilities, additional resources and support are typically required, and these resources can be very costly. That's why Congress passed the Individuals with Disability in Education Act, or the IDEA, which provides federal grants to states to help pay for the technology, staff training, and special education programs that students with disabilities need to thrive. Importantly, if certain public schools cannot offer this support, the IDEA alternatively provides for funding for students to attend private schools that can. My clients, the Lothmans, the Taxes, and the Peretzes, are 3 Jewish families in California who are raising children with disabilities alongside their non-disabled children. For these families, their Jewish beliefs obligate them to provide all their children with an education rooted in their Jewish faith. The IDEA's funding program should have been an incredible opportunity for these families to equip their children with the tools necessary to flourish both academically and spiritually. All 3 families, however, were denied this opportunity, and they were barred from obtaining IDEA funding because the schools best able to support the totality of their child's needs were Jewish, not secular private schools. This is because California law prohibits the use of IDEA funding in private religious schools while providing millions of dollars of IDEA funding to identical special education services in secular private schools. And California enforces this restriction even when public schools cannot adequately meet a child's special education needs. That puts families like my clients to an impossible choice. Compromise your religious identity to receive critical special education funding, or preserve your child's religious development and forego the special education funding promised by the IDEA. One of my clients speaks well about how they literally had to give up on speech therapy for one of their children because they couldn't afford it. They were working multiple jobs, and even so, they could not afford this while choosing to send their kids to a religious school. So with nowhere else to turn, and in partnership with Beckett and the Orthodox Union, which is the nation's largest Orthodox Jewish umbrella organization, these families were forced into federal court to defend their religious and parental rights. In court, I argued that under the Supreme Court's precedent in Trinity Lutheran, Espinoza, and Carson, some cases we're well familiar with, the U.S. Constitution prohibits discrimination based on my client's religious exercise. Unfortunately, a Los Angeles federal district court disagreed, but these brave parents did not give up. Together, we appealed the case, and in a unanimous decision in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the court, quote, easily concluded that California's law was unconstitutional because it, quote, on its face burdens the free exercise rights of parents. This was a critical precedent-setting victory that will benefit religious families with disabilities across the country. But the fight isn't over. This case involved just one unconstitutional prohibition on just one set of public benefits in just one state. But thankfully, our Constitution prohibits this kind of rank discrimination regardless of where it occurs or what form it takes. So what recommendations can this commission make to ensure government actors stop thwarting constitutional protections? I want to offer just 3 quick recommendations. First, the commission should urge the president to advance Department of Education regulations confirming that religious schools are eligible for all IDEA programs and that religious parents have the right to access those funds on the same footing as secular parents. Second, the commission should recommend a comprehensive review of state and local restrictions on religious exercise, including the notorious Blaine amendments, and urge the Department of Justice to challenge those unconstitutional laws in court. This would help bring states in line with a growing series of federal precedents confirming that religion-based exclusions are odious to our Constitution. Finally, the commission should urge federal agencies to repeal the arbitrary rules and regulations that restrict the government's ability to partner with faith-based organizations. In their place, agencies should explicitly protect the ability and the freedom of faith-based organizations, including schools, to participate in federal funding programs on equal terms with secular organizations. If we want to live up to the ideals enshrined in our Constitution, we must respect the religious commitments of all of our citizens, and especially those children with disabilities who need us most. Thank you for your time and your commitment to religious freedom. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, commissioners, for the opportunity to speak with you and for all the great work you're doing on behalf of our country. May the Lord bless the work of your hands. My name is Jason Bedrick. I'm a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Center for Education Policy, and I am the product of a good Catholic education. You can laugh, yes. I was the first Jew to receive the Religious Studies Award upon graduation from Bishop Girton Catholic High School, where my parents, I grew up in a secular Jewish home. My parents sent me there for, ostensibly for the better secular education that they offered. But what I found is that at Catholic school, they asked questions like, is there a God? And if so, what type of God is he? And what does God want from you? These, I realized, were the most important questions, and they were questions that were never asked and could not be asked at public school. And that's what catalyzed my own faith journey. Faith has always been at the center of education. The late, great Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, who was the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, was fond of observing that Moses, on the eve of the Exodus from Egypt, did not speak to the Israelites about what Nelson Mandela called the long walk to freedom, nor did he speak to the Israelites even about the promised land, the land of milk and honey. He spoke about the duty of parents to educate their children. And at the end of Moses' life, as they were about to enter that promised land and build a covenantal society, he said, "V'shenantam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shivtecha v'vesecha v'lechtecha v'aderech." You shall teach these words to your children diligently. You shall speak of them in your home. You shall speak of them when you walk on the way. You shall speak of them when you lie down and when you rise up. Rabbi Sacks commented on this. Why is education so fundamental? Because to defend a country, you need an army. But to defend a civilization, you need schools. You need education as the conversation between generations. We need to teach our children and they theirs what we aspire to in the ideals we were bequeathed by those who came before us. Our founders understood this. Thomas Jefferson was at first, from the nation's earliest days, America has strived to make education universal, viewing it as essential for cultural transmission, moral formation, and self-government. Thomas Jefferson warned, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. In 1647, Massachusetts Bay Colony enacted what was essentially the first proto-public school law, which said that if you had a town above a certain size, you had to provide for the education of children. It's known as the Old Deluder-Satan Act because of its famous line, where it says, why is it, in this, again, America's first essentially public school law, why is it that children needed to learn to read? Because they needed to learn to read the scripture. Because if they didn't read the scripture, they were in danger of being tricked into sinning by that old deluder Satan. And yet there is an inherent tension between government schooling on the one hand and religious liberty and parental rights on the other. Because, as we heard Charlie Kirk say earlier, there is no such thing as a values-neutral classroom. There is no naked public square. There is no naked classroom. Schools inevitably transmit values through both the explicit curriculum and the hidden curriculum, the unspoken lessons embedded in classroom routines, institutional norms, which topics are or not discussed. When teachers choose which historical narratives to emphasize and how to handle discussions of religion or references to God or what behaviors to reward, They make value-laden decisions that communicate messages about authority, morality, and worldview. Even seemingly neutral choices, from daily schedules that do or don't accommodate religious observances to the way mathematical or scientific topics are framed, reflect particular assumptions about the role of faith and secular knowledge in society. Government-run schools, by their nature, reflect the values and priorities of the state. As John Stuart Mill warned in On Liberty, government-run schooling runs the risk of establishing a despotism over the mind, leading by natural tendency to one over the body. This is especially true where the government has a monopoly over education. And this tension is particularly acute in areas concerning moral and religious beliefs. When public schools promote ideologies that contradict deeply held beliefs of families, parents are placed in an impossible position: either surrender their children to an educational environment that undermines their values, or bear the financial burden of seeking alternatives. And in recent years, as we've heard in previous panels and at the last hearing, these tensions have become much more obvious as ideologues have co-opted many public schools to push radical agendas to a captive audience of children. Parents have increasingly objected to lessons that are inimical, there's that word again, to their values, especially those dealing with gender and sexuality. While some parents have sought to exercise their right to opt out their children from such instruction, as recognized in Mahmoud v. Taylor, many schools have embedded the same ideological themes across the curriculum, leaving families with no meaningful escape. In effect, the only option left is to withdraw from the public school system entirely. However, this solution imposes a significant financial burden on parents who must shoulder the cost of private schooling or home education, while, of course, paying taxes to the public schools that they cannot use. As the Supreme Court held in Mahmoud, the availability of private and homeschooling is no answer to parents' First Amendment objectives, as many parents cannot afford such a substitute. The best way to resolve these tensions is through a robust system of universal school choice, similar to the policy 17 states have adopted in the past 5 years, including the great state of Texas and my adopted home state of Arizona. As Nobel laureate economist Milton Friedman observed, the government's interest in ensuring that every child has access to a quality education does not imply that government should run the schools. Instead, public funds should follow the child to the educational environment that best meets his or her learning needs and aligns with his or her family's values. School choice respects parental rights and religious liberty and fosters a more diverse set of schooling options that better reflects the great diversity of American families than one-size-fits-some status quo. But, and this is key, for school choice to be meaningful, private school autonomy must be preserved. We talked about the landmark Pierce decision 100 years ago, where the Supreme Court held that the fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose prevents the government from attempts to standardize its children by forcing them into public schools. This same fundamental liberty should prevent the government from imposing regulations on private schools that would standardize private education. Unfortunately, some states have tried to do just that. You heard from Carol Conley earlier about the attempts by the state of Maine to circumvent very clear school choice rulings. Likewise, you heard from Rabbi Zwiebel about attempts by New York State to impose public school curricular norms on Orthodox Jewish schools. New York state law, which New York has no school choice policy, yet their law requires private schools to provide an education that is substantially equivalent to that offered by the public schools. But the Constitution protects the right of parents to choose schools that are substantially different from the public schools. So in closing, the federal government has a compelling interest in ensuring states do not violate constitutionally protected parental rights or religious liberty. It should not stand idly by while states are using regulatory tools to coerce conformity and suppress educational freedom and pluralism. Only by protecting parental rights and empowering parents with school choice can we ensure that America's education system respects and reflects our deepest commitments to religious liberty, pluralism, and self-government. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. We would not have school choice if it weren't for President Trump in Texas. It was his willingness to get in the fight and defeat those who were against it in the last election. It was his willingness to push those who remained to vote for it in the end. It was a team effort, but without him, we wouldn't have school choice. He is the most important person to the school choice movement in the history of this country. Without question. Now we'll go to Professor Nicole Garnett, and if you can stay within 5 minutes would be helpful.
Sure, thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here today, and I hope I can contribute in some small way to these important deliberations. I've spent the entirety of my professional life fighting for parental choice in education and for religious schools' rights to participate fully in parental choice programs. As a baby lawyer, a young attorney in the 90s at the Institute for Justice, I helped defend the inclusion of the first defend against Establishment Clause challenges, the first voucher programs to include religious schools. And I filed the first lawsuit challenging the exclusion of religious schools from Maine's town tuitioning program. So justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. I do this, my work has been animated by the understanding that the fight for parental choice is not about increasing test scores, but fundamentally it is about empowering parents to fulfill their sacred obligations to help their children become the men and women that God has called them to be. And giving parents the freedom to form their children, mind, body, and soul through the medium of faith-based schools is critical for our nation's future. Faith-based schools, think about a couple of things. Kids who participate in parental choice programs are more, and most of them attend faith-based schools, are more likely to graduate from high school, go to college, graduate from college, get married, stay married, maintain stable employment, and avoid involvement with the criminal justice system. They're more involved in their communities, they're more tolerant of diversity, and better educated about our political system. And I'd ask ourselves why, and I'll just give you an intuition that I think is shared by many today, is because faith-based schools understand that their mission is not just about instruction that can be separated from faith, but is about human formation that cannot. They understand that kids entrusted to their care are made in the image and likeness of a loving God, and they therefore have a moral obligation to bring them to their full God-given potential. And when the law deprives parents of meaningful choices or strips faith-based schools of their abilities to be fully themselves, this crucial transformative mission is compromised, and our families, our community, and our nation suffer as a result. So I'll skip over the good news, but there is a lot of good news, a lot more parental choice, thanks to Texas. When Texas, now we have about 50% of American school children are eligible to participate in a parental choice program. About 1.5 million do. The first, thanks to President Trump, the first ever private school choice program, federal private school choice program was included in the big, beautiful bill. It has the potential to bring private school choice and options for families to every state in the country. And most of these programs are actually quite respectful of the religious liberty rights of parents and of the schools participating. And that's all great news. And also, the Supreme Court, in a series of cases that we've already heard about, have cleared away the rubble of past decisions, including, importantly, Lemon, and made clear that the Constitution demands that equal treatment of believers and institutions and religious conduct, and taken away the idea that the opposite, the wrong-headed idea that the opposite is true. So this is actually an exciting time for the parental choice movement, an exciting time for believers in faith-based education, but it's not time to declare victory. Important challenges remain, and because my time is limited, I just want to highlight one, and that challenge is this, that although the Supreme Court has made clear over and over and over again, the First Amendment prohibits the government from discriminating against religion, there are hundreds of state and federal laws on the books that require the government to do exactly that. As a website developed by my employer, Notre Dame Law School, and the Orthodox Union's Teach Coalition, www.religiousequality.net, religiousEquality.com was apparently taken. We've demonstrated that religious discrimination, explicit religious discrimination, and I'm not talking about what we just heard about, like other rules that also burden religious freedom, explicit discrimination against religious believers, institution, and religious conduct pervade state and federal law. These laws limit religious freedom across all of society, a range of public programs, but I'll just offer a few examples from education law. You can find the rest on the website, religiousequality.net. At the state level, we identified 364 statutes and 104 regulations that discriminate against religion. A few examples from the education space. All states impose religious restrictions on charter schools, which are privately operated. Many do the same for pre-K, privately operated pre-K programs and special education providers, as we just heard. Many states allow high school students to enroll in classes at college, including private college at public expense, but limit their freedom to take classes at religious colleges for dual credit. Some have college scholarship programs that exclude students attending religious colleges or students studying theology. Others require students in work-study programs to refrain from engaging in religious conduct. The federal level, we identified 135 unconstitutional statutes and regulations, 41 of which restrict the religious liberty of private educational institutions, typically by requiring them to refrain from engaging in religious conduct as a condition of receiving federal funds. Many of these laws employ language that trace its origin to Lemon. All of these restrictions are unconstitutional. This isn't a complicated legal question. It's a clear constitutional demand. There is no need to wait for lawsuits. Although we welcome lawsuits, to obey this command, the administration can and should take immediate action, including what Mr. Reeves mentioned, by issue guidance clarifying that laws requiring religious discrimination in public programs are not enforceable, and it should direct the states to do the same. It's that simple. So I'd like to close on a personal note. I am the product of public schools. As a child, my family experienced some pretty significant economic hardship, and I'm very grateful for the education, the excellent education that I received in my public schools. I know that I would not be here today. I know that my life would have looked very different but for that education. But I'm also a Catholic convert and a Catholic school mom. All 4 of our kids have attended Catholic schools. 2 still do. One is a senior at Notre Dame, and the youngest is in 7th grade. Shout out to 7th grade. And in my 20 years as a Catholic school mom, I've learned that Catholic schools are not places that kids are simply instructed, but rather that they are places where families experience authentic Christian community, where the joy of vocation is modeled every day, where faith and reason are integrated, and where teachers and administrators seek to bring children to wholeness in the image of the loving God who created them. And I have learned that there are places where children are formed, and I like to think that Charlie Kirk would embrace this model. To quote from Blessed Basil Moreau, "Children are formed to be useful citizens of this world and joyful citizens of the next." I am here today because I want all families to have the freedom to choose their children's schools, including authentically religious ones, freed from burdensome regulations and discriminatory laws that strip them of their ability to fulfill the very mission that makes them so transformative. This has been my life's work, and I am grateful for the Commission's commitment to advancing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly?
Carol, I want to make sure everybody understands what's going on with Bangor Christian, because you won this case at the Supreme Court where Maine said, we're going to change our approach that we've had for almost 100 years, and we're going to deny Christian schools to participate. The Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional.
Correct.
And so then the Attorney General and the legislature said bad things about the Supreme Court. I think they even read your doctrinal statement as they passed a new law banning schools like you to participate in the school choice program.
Because they did horrible things. These schools teach things like that the man should be the head of the home, and obviously the biblical sexual ethic. And so in Maine specifically, they said if you're going to receive funds, then you have to abide by the Human Rights Commission, which basically is bow down to the state of Maine if you're going to receive any funding.
I mean, I'd love to know your description. I mean, again, we've heard a few examples today of sort of people losing school districts, et cetera, and then just being defiant of the law. How do you see this?
And this isn't something new, Kelly, by the way. When I was the headmaster, so I haven't been the headmaster since 2000. As you know, I've been the Family Policy Council Director. I just retired in June for the past 15 years. But even when I was the headmaster, the islands would call us, the very independent islands that don't have high schools, and would pay for the students to go and thumb their nose at the state because it was through the municipalities. But yes, we now have districts like Hodgdon, Maine, up on the Canadian border, these very conservative rural districts are saying, we're not going to abide by the HRC. So even the public schools now are turning against what this administration is going on. So there are, even though no one has actually gone all the way to it, but there is a movement towards saying, what is the path that we can somehow ignore what the Attorney General is saying, what the legislature is saying, and set up a system where parents could have this choice. And it's been very encouraging.
I've always heard the conservative argument against school choice being that if you take them, there'll be strings that will violate your Christian school or your religious school. It seems like this is the test case on that.
I think it's the test case, but we've already proven before 1980, when I was a student there, that wasn't the case at all. It certainly is not the case. Now, if a school chooses not to do that, then, God bless them, but we think they should have the option to do that. The other thing that Maine citizens are doing, Kelly, is they are applauding President Trump's threats to take away federal funding on these issues. So and if anybody knows anything about Maine, there are two Maines, and the northern Maine would like to somehow secede, but at this point there's a lot of great thankfulness on these issues with this administration, for sure.
Any other question, members? Thank you very much. Great testimony. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. We have two speakers that have about 5 or 6 minutes to speak on a couple of issues dealing with education, and that will wrap up today. Give them a chance to be seated. Thank you all for staying with us. Welcome. Good to have a Texan here. Yes, Dr. Beckwith, have about 6 or 7 minutes to talk about the freedom of education and our heritage in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Chairman Patrick, Vice Chair Carson, and all the members of the Commission. It's truly an honor to serve on the Commission's Advisory Board of Legal Experts and to share with you this afternoon my thoughts on the religious liberty challenges in our public schools and universities. To fully appreciate these challenges, we have to remind ourselves why the U.S. Constitution and all state constitutions protect religious liberty. The American founders sought to forge an understanding of religious liberty that was born of their experience under British rule and what they knew of the historical record of religious persecutions throughout Europe. Rejecting both religious indifferentism and theocracy, the founders embraced a view that recognized that the government should not coerce a citizen's religious beliefs or practices, and in that sense should remain neutral about religion. On the other hand, their view also recognized that human beings have a natural inclination to pursue a right relationship with their Creator, and that our temporal happiness and our eternal fate depend on it. But in that sense, the government should think of religion as a public good whose practitioners should be accommodated as long as they do not threaten the civil peace and public order. As James Madison once put it, because we hold it for a fundamental and undeniable truth that religion or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, the religion then of every man must be left to the conviction of conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as they may dictate. This right is in its nature an unalienable right, unquote. For Madison, the preservation of religious liberty requires the government to acknowledge that it does not have absolute and universal jurisdiction over all matters of life. Again, to quote Madison, "We maintain, therefore, that in matters of religion, no man's right is abridged by the institution of civil society, and that religion is wholly exempt from its cognizance." What also stands out about the founders' understanding of religious liberty is its epistemic modesty. Now, what is epistemic modesty? That refers to the humble recognition of our intellectual limits, and that on matters of religion and religious belief, our fellow citizens can arrive at differing and sometimes contrary convictions, even though they are just as reasonable and knowledgeable as we are. But this is what we should expect in a free society. Figures like Madison did not see religion as just another exercise of personal preference, as some of our contemporaries may see it. They understood religious belief to be a matter of conscience and conviction, not something one explicitly chooses, like a pair of slacks that could be tailored to one's specifications. The Quaker or the Jehovah's Witness, for example, does not reject military service because he does not want to participate in war. Rather, he rejects military service because he cannot, as a matter of conscience, participate in war. We, of course, do not live in the world of the American founding. At that time, the religious divisions within the country were almost exclusively between differing confessional traditions of American Protestantism. But over the decades, as the nation expanded in size and population, it not only became more religiously diverse, the beliefs and practices of its elite class in the university, the arts, media, and public education became, in general, more secular and less welcoming of serious religious voices that dissent from the pieties of secular progressivism. As the sociologist Peter Berger once observed, if India is the most religious country in the world and Sweden the most secular, then America is a country of Indians led by Swedes. Virtually none of today's religious liberty conflicts cut across conventional religious lines as they once did at the American founding and well into the 20th century. Rather, they reflect the deep divisions between the moral and civic convictions of a secular elite and the moral and religious convictions of citizens across a diversity of faith traditions. We have seen this phenomenon played out in the testimonies you've heard in the 2 hearings dealing with education. These witnesses provided shocking accounts of the persecution they had to endure in our public schools and universities. In some cases, teachers and administrators refused to accommodate the religious convictions of students and staff members, while in other cases, they marginalized and punished religious students and staff members because they had the temerity to insist they follow their conscience rather than acquiesce to the spirit of the age. What is particularly striking in these cases is how the advocates of the government seemed incapable of envisioning how anyone could reasonably disagree with the burden they sought to place on their fellow citizens. In some of these cases, students were forced to participate in activities contrary to their religious convictions, while their views were subjected to ridicule and disparaging comments by officials who seemed to harbor contempt for these students and their families. In other cases, the schools intentionally restricted religious speech and conduct for no other reason than the conduct was, and the speech, religious. This type of behavior on the part of those school officials is in stark contrast to the sort of civic virtues that the American founders sought to cultivate in their compatriots: epistemic modesty, respect for conscience and conviction, and proper regard for how one's neighbor understands her duty to God. Some school officials have claimed that their contested policies are neutral as to religion, but that defense just doesn't ring true. One, for example, a school explicitly requires its students and staff members to assent to moral beliefs or engage in activities that are inherently hostile to the religious views of students and staff members across a diversity of faith traditions. The school is, in fact, not being neutral as to religion. This is why when a school accommodates religious students and staff members, it is showing appropriate respect for the natural consequence of what happens to a free people living in a free society. Citizens will come to different conclusions about their duty to God. But when a school rejects such accommodations and insists that its students and staff members assent and conform or suffer punishment, it is signaling to the rest of us that it does not want to serve a free people living in a free society, that in fact it sees its project as enforcing the doctrines of the secular equivalent of a confessional state. To properly honor the memory of Charlie Kirk, this commission should recommend legislation and executive action that encourage our educational institutions to promote a culture of conversation and listening, one that rejects an unbending progressive orthodoxy that has effectively functioned for decades to undermine the kind of civic friendship that allows us to live and learn together in peace, despite our religious and sometimes political differences. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Beckler. Please keep your seat in case there's a question after. Our last witness of the day, Hannah Earl. She's the Faith Director for the Department of Education, representing the Secretary, Linda McMahon. Good to have you with us. And you have about 5 or 6 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here today and taking your time for this discussion. And also thank you, members of the Commission. My name is Hannah Earl. I am the Director of the Center for Faith at the Department of Education. So what does that mean? We empower parents in their pursuit of meaningful learning. We ensure that religious stakeholders have a voice in policymaking, and we communicate what it will look like when we fulfill our instruction to facilitate the closure of the department. So I'm here to give you a very brief overview of some of the steps that have been taken and the orientation that will mark our future as, again, we work toward that goal. One of the most effective safeguards of religious liberty is the empowerment of parents to direct their children's education. We have discussed today, and as I'm sure many of you know, it is the 100-year anniversary of the Pierce decision. That is monumental. The inheritors of religious liberty are those who gave it to us, which is faith-based schools. And as many of you know as well, the majority of K through 12 private schools in this country are faith-based. That is a testament not only to the religious community in this country, but I think also the American character itself. As we approach America 250, we have the opportunity of a century. In President Trump's landmark piece of legislation, the One Big Beautiful Bill, contained a watershed moment for both religious freedom and school choice. And that is, of course, the scholarship portion of it, which gives $1,700 tax credits to those who donate to scholarship-granting organizations. This is an incredible opportunity, the likes of which we have never seen in this country, to expand faith-based education. It will require a grassroots effort, as I'm sure all of you know, because states do have to opt into this program. And I assure you, you will be hearing more from us about that as we move forward, as well as those within your spheres of influence communicating just what that will look like. This dedication to returning rightful education to parents is itself an astonishing political achievement. And I am very thankful for the leadership of President Trump and Secretary McMahon in fulfilling not only a campaign promise, but one of the most uniting aspects of the conservative movement in the past 60 years. So while I have you for just a few moments, I want to provide, as I said, a very brief overview of some of the actions already taken and those actions that will continue to guide us as we move toward returning education to the states, and in so doing, return it to the hands of parents. Fewer than 10 days into this administration, we had 2 very vital executive orders. One of them targeted the ending radicalization and indoctrination in K through 12 schooling. The other supported parents explicitly in choosing the proper education for their children. An example of this was discretionary grants going to charter schools, which, if you've seen the news this past couple of weeks, the department has moved on that very decidedly. I want to share also some points that the Department of Education included in the anti-Christian bias report, to say nothing of the ways in which the department has held universities responsible for the targeting and harassment and violence of Jewish students on some of our most elite college campuses. The department is dedicated to ending the weaponization of policies targeting Christian higher education. The department will no longer disproportionately target colleges and universities for their beliefs and will affirm the rights of these colleges and universities to act in accordance with their faith-based identity. Another example, we have ended the targeting of school boards via the elimination of the Biden book ban czar, which attempted to monitor those who objected to content in classrooms largely on religious grounds. I hope all of this underscores the remarkable dedication of this administration from day one to ensuring that Americans can live according to their convictions, and specifically their religious ones. So as we move forward, I would like to ask two things: for your prayers and your partnership. Returning education to the states means returning education to parents and communities. That is necessarily a grassroots effort that will engage Americans at every level of government and civil society. So I'm asking you to exercise your own spheres of influence as we move toward that goal. I want to thank all of you again for being here. And I thank all of you in your efforts to train up a child in the way that he should go so that he will not depart from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Any questions for either witness before we close? We have 4 minutes before closing on time, Reverend Franklin. Carrie?
Thank you so much. I'm very inspired by what you said. I live in California. I have a lot of mothers with young children that a lot of them can't afford private school. What are some ways, I understand what you're saying about grassroots efforts, but can you give me just one or two examples of what mothers and fathers can do locally, to combat this?
Develop relationships with your community leaders and also at every level of government. As I said, this is an incredible opportunity that we have, but our lawmakers at every level have to understand the demand. And I think one of the most incredible things about this country, as we've seen, is that we can remain responsive. We do remain responsive to the needs of constituents. And there are so many ways to make those desires known. So those relationships, whether that's in your civic association, whether it's at the Chamber of Commerce, whether it is non-school affiliated parental groups, to develop those relationships and have very active conversations with every sort of legislator that you can contact, because that is what it will take. And I want to underscore the commitment, because I'm not sure everyone understands this, quite candidly, how committed we are at the department to fulfilling the directive to shut it down. It impacts everything we do every day, but that requires parents and communities and state leaders to take the charges that we are giving them.
Thank you.
Allison?
Thank you. Dr. Beckwith, I wanted to touch on something I heard you say. I think you said something to the effect of that the founders saw religion is not just another expression of individual liberty. And I think if there's one thing that we've been impressed by in all of our hearings, it is that given the level of persecution and prosecution in our country today, neutrality would be a huge advance. Yet that, in a sense, would sell our founders' vision short, wouldn't it? I mean, they singled out religion, if anything, for special treatment in our Constitution to protect the free exercise. So I just sort of like to hear your thoughts on
that's right. So this is something that's been occurring recently in the legal literature, this argument that religion isn't special. Mm-hmm. And I think it comes from several different places. One is this sort of natural, or kind of the American impulse for kind of egalitarianism. So people, well, to single out religion is in fact to say that citizens that don't practice religion are not fully citizens. I don't think that's the right understanding of what the founders intended. They saw religion or religious duty as something that is natural to human life, and that they also obviously knew that there were people that didn't practice religion. But in the same way that the fact that certain people never fall in love doesn't mean that the government shouldn't single out marriage for special protections, right? So there is something, I don't think at the end of the day you can actually have a fully neutral state when it comes to something like religion. I mean, either human beings are ordered towards having the right relationship with the transcendent, that is God, or they're not. And I think that throughout history, the kind of diversity and pluralism with which we're accustomed is the consequence of actually believing that. So this is why people from religious traditions and everyone who belongs to a religious tradition believes that they're right. On the other hand, there's also an acknowledgement that in order for one to have authentic faith, it must be assented to freely. But ultimately, I think that presupposes that there's a divine reality. I mean, that, I think, makes the most sense.
Thank you. Our next hearing is November 17th. We're actually going on the road to Dallas. And those watching online or on a network, hope you'll join us then. I want to thank all the people behind the scenes at the Museum of the Bible for our first 3 hearings. They've been terrific to work with. We will return. This is our 3rd hearing. We have a total of 8 planned. Could be 1 more, could be 1 less in the spring. But I want to thank them, and we will be back here at the museum in the new year, but the next hearing will be in Dallas, Texas. Reverend Graham, would you close us with the prayer?
Our Heavenly Father, we come today to say thank you to our president who cares about religious freedom more than any president in my lifetime. Father, so we thank you for him, and we pray that you'd watch over and protect him. And Father, we pray that you'll bless him. And Father, we thank you that he's appointed this commission. And so we pray for each one around this table, each commissioner, and we thank you for them and their input. And Father, these witnesses that we have heard today, how some of them have suffered for their faith and are still suffering for their faith. Father, we pray that you'll give our chairman of this commission and the rest of us your wisdom as how we can help the president so we can turn this wicked system around that's attacking your church and your believers, your followers. Father, thank you for this opportunity. We pray that we'll be faithful to you in all that we say and do. And we pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend, and God bless all of you. Thank you.